In 1570, a single sentence written in Rome turned England into the most surveilled country on earth. The Pope declared Elizabeth I a heretic, freed her subjects from their loyalty, and quietly authorized her murder. What followed was 45 years of hidden war, coded letters sewn into book spines, assassins trained in seminaries, and priests crammed into holes barely large enough to breathe in. This documentary tells the story of that war and of the paranoid genius who turned espionage into the weapon that saved a queen and built the British Secret Service. Long before Elizabeth Tudor ever sat upon the throne of England, her kingdom was already at war with itself. The conflict was not fought with armies massing on open fields, but with something far more dangerous: belief. It began with a king who wanted a divorce. In 1534, Henry VIII did something that shook the foundations of Western Christendom. Unable to convince Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry simply removed the Pope from the equation entirely. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament that same year, declared the English monarch the supreme head of the Church of England. With the stroke of a pen, 1,000 years of papal authority over England was severed. What followed was nothing less than the systematic dismantling of Catholic England. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry dissolved more than 800 monasteries, priories, and convents. Ancient institutions that had fed the poor, preserved manuscripts, and anchored communities for generations were stripped bare. Their lands were sold off to the new Protestant gentry, creating a class of men with a profound financial interest in keeping England Protestant. The bells fell silent. The candles were extinguished. The old world was being torn down, stone by stone. But Henry's Reformation was never truly complete. The country remained deeply divided, its people caught between the old faith and the new. When Henry died in 1547 and his young son Edward VI pushed England toward harder Protestant doctrine, the tension only deepened. Then Edward died young, and everything changed again. Mary I came to the throne in 1553 with a singular mission: to return England to Rome. The daughter of the discarded Catherine of Aragon, Mary had every reason to despise what her father had built. She reunited England with the papacy and set about purging Protestant heresy with terrifying efficiency. In less than 4 years, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. Bishops, scholars, and ordinary men and women died in public squares across England, the smell of smoke and the sound of crowds witnessing what fear and religious certainty could produce. The victims would be immortalized in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, a text that would harden Protestant hearts for generations. Mary earned her enduring epithet, Bloody Mary, not through propaganda alone, but through the searing memory of those flames. When Mary died in 1558, she left behind a kingdom more bitterly divided than she had found it. The burnings had not extinguished Protestantism. They had fed it. Into this fractured, exhausted, and deeply suspicious kingdom stepped a 25-year-old woman who had survived her father's volatility, her brother's reign, and her sister's prisons. Elizabeth Tudor was now queen, and Rome was watching very closely. She had entered the world under a cloud that never fully lifted. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry VIII had torn England from Rome to marry. Elizabeth Tudor was barely 3 years old when her mother was arrested on charges of adultery and treason. Whether those charges were true or fabricated by political enemies has been debated by historians ever since. What is certain is this. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. The little girl with the red hair and her mother's dark eyes was declared illegitimate within days. Bastard. The word followed Elizabeth like a shadow through her childhood. She was removed from the line of succession, her parents' marriage annulled as though it had never existed. What does a child make of that? What kind of mind does it forge to grow up knowing that the circumstances of your birth are considered a stain, an embarrassment, a political inconvenience? A sharp one, as it turned out. A watchful one. Elizabeth received one of the finest educations available to any person in 16th century Europe. Tutored in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, trained in rhetoric and philosophy, she became a formidably intelligent young woman. But intelligence alone does not explain her survival. What kept Elizabeth alive through the reigns of her brother and sister was something rarer. An instinct for saying exactly as much as was necessary and not a single word more. That instinct was tested most severely in 1554. Mary I, newly crowned and determined to restore Catholicism, faced a Protestant rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. Elizabeth's name surfaced in the investigation, the suggestion being that she had known of the conspiracy. She almost certainly had not. But suspicion was enough. On the 18th of March, 1554, Elizabeth was escorted through the Traitor's Gate and into the Tower of London. She sat down on the cold stone steps and refused to move, reportedly declaring she was no traitor. It was a performance of defiance and despair in equal measure. She was 20 years old. She knew what the Tower had meant for her mother. She survived. Lack of evidence, political caution, and perhaps a reluctant mercy from Mary spared her. She was eventually moved to house arrest at Woodstock, where she remained under watch for nearly a year. She had learned, in the most visceral way possible, that survival required patience, not confrontation. When Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, Elizabeth received the news at Hatfield House, reportedly beneath an oak tree. She was 25 years old and suddenly Queen of England. But not everyone agreed. Across Catholic Europe, the whisper was immediate and unanimous. Elizabeth was illegitimate. Her parents' marriage had never been valid in the eyes of Rome. That made her not a queen, but a usurper occupying a throne that belonged, by Catholic logic, to someone else. Philip II of Spain, who had been married to Mary, briefly considered Elizabeth a useful ally. Pope Paul IV was less accommodating. He made clear that no heretic born of an invalid union could be recognized as a legitimate monarch. The young queen, absorbing these messages in her first weeks of power, understood something with absolute clarity. Her throne rested on contested ground. Her legitimacy was disputed by the most powerful religious institution in the world. And the choices she made about faith, about politics, about England's place in Christendom would determine whether she ruled for years or months. She had already spent a lifetime learning how to survive. Now she would have to learn how to govern, and those two skills, as she would soon discover, were not always the same thing. The crown was barely settled on Elizabeth's head before the question of religion demanded an answer. England in 1558 was a country that had changed its official faith 4 times in 25 years. Its people were exhausted by theological whiplash, by altars stripped and restored, by priests who had learned to believe whatever the monarch required. What Elizabeth needed was not another revolution. She needed a settlement. She moved carefully, but she moved quickly. In the spring of 1559, Parliament passed 2 pieces of legislation that would define England for generations. The Act of Supremacy made Elizabeth the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title chosen with deliberate precision. Not Supreme Head, as her father had styled himself. That title had troubled even Protestant-leaning bishops who could not imagine a woman holding spiritual authority over men. Governor was subtler, more administrative, less theologically provocative. It was exactly the kind of distinction that sounded minor and meant everything. The Act of Uniformity followed, imposing a revised Book of Common Prayer on all English churches. The service would be conducted in English, not Latin. The old Catholic Mass was gone. But the new prayer book was written with studied ambiguity, particularly around the central question of communion. The words spoken during the Eucharist were crafted to allow both a Protestant and a broadly Catholic interpretation. What exactly happened to the bread and the wine? The settlement, deliberately, did not say. William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal secretary and the most important architect of her domestic policy, understood the genius of vagueness. Cecil was a committed Protestant, but he was also a ruthlessly practical administrator. He grasped that a settlement demanding too much would provoke resistance, while one demanding too little would collapse. The goal was to construct a church broad enough that most people could attend without feeling their conscience was being destroyed. Attendance at Church of England services was compulsory, enforced by small fines for absences. But what a person privately believed remained, for now, their own business. In those early years, a remarkable number of Catholics complied. They attended the new services, paid their fines when they did not, and waited. Many assumed the settlement was temporary, that Elizabeth might marry a Catholic prince, that Rome might yet reclaim England through diplomacy rather than force. The penalties for recusancy, for outright refusal to attend Protestant services, were real but manageable. The machinery of persecution that had defined Mary's reign was notably absent. Elizabeth had watched people burn for their beliefs. She had no appetite to repeat the spectacle. This period of relative quiet masked the profound instability beneath. The Catholic bishops, almost without exception, refused to take the oath of supremacy and were removed from their posts. A new generation of Protestant clergy began filling the churches. The old devotional world, with its saints' days and holy images and Latin prayers, was being quietly dismantled. For ordinary people, the change was not sudden. It accumulated year by year, service by service, until one morning the world their grandparents had known was simply gone. The settlement satisfied almost no one completely. Committed Protestants, many of whom had spent Mary's reign in exile absorbing the fierce Reformed theology of Geneva and Zurich, found the new church too ceremonial, too compromised, too much like Rome in its vestments and its structures. Catholics who paid attention to Rome knew that compliance was, at best, a temporary accommodation. The question was not whether the settlement would face a challenge. The question was where that challenge would come from first and what form it would take when it arrived. She arrived on the southern shore of the Solway Firth in a small fishing boat, exhausted, shorn of her famous auburn hair, wearing borrowed clothes. Mary, Queen of Scots, had crossed from Scotland into England on the 16th of May, 1568. She was 25 years old. She would never see Scotland again. The road to that fishing boat had been steep and swift. Mary had returned to Scotland from France in 1561 as a young widow. Her first husband, the French King Francis II, dead of an ear infection before either of them reached their 20s. Scotland, in her absence, had been reshaped by the fierce Calvinist Reformation of John Knox, a man who held approximately no admiration for Catholic queens. Yet Mary had managed for a time with surprising political grace. Then came the disasters, each one arriving faster than the last. Her second marriage to the vain and unstable Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, curdled almost immediately. The murder of her secretary David Rizzio, stabbed 56 times in front of the pregnant queen by a group that included her own husband, signaled how far things had unraveled. Darnley himself was dead less than a year later, his house outside Edinburgh demolished by an explosion whose authorship was never conclusively established. Then, barely 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married the man most suspected of organizing the murder. James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, was magnetic and dangerous, and almost certainly guilty. The marriage was catastrophic. Scotland's Protestant lords rose against her, captured her, forced her abdication in favor of her infant son James, and imprisoned her in a castle on a loch. She escaped after less than a year, raised a small army, lost the Battle of Langside in a single afternoon, and fled south. To England. To Elizabeth. What followed was one of the most agonizing political calculations of Elizabeth's reign. Mary wrote to her cousin almost immediately, expecting sympathy, shelter, perhaps assistance in reclaiming her throne. And Elizabeth did feel something genuine, a deep and uncomfortable solidarity. Here was a fellow queen brought low by rebellious subjects. Everything in Elizabeth's conception of monarchy recoiled at the precedent. If subjects could depose a queen in Scotland, what lesson did that teach English subjects? She wrote that the sight of Mary's situation caused her more pain than she could express. But feeling and acting were different things entirely. The Catholic world had long since drawn its own map of the situation. For Rome, for Philip II of Spain, for the Guise family in France who were Mary's powerful relatives, the arithmetic was straightforward. Mary was Catholic. Mary descended from Henry VII through his daughter Margaret. In Catholic eyes, Elizabeth was illegitimate, the daughter of a marriage Rome had never recognized. Mary was therefore the rightful Queen of England. She had actually quartered the English royal arms alongside her own during her time in France, a provocation Elizabeth had not forgotten. To release Mary was to loose a Catholic claimant upon Europe's courts. To return her to Scotland was to restore a problem Elizabeth could not control. And to support her restoration by force risked war with the Protestant Scottish lords who were, inconveniently, England's most useful northern allies. Elizabeth chose a fourth option, one that was perhaps no option at all. She kept Mary in England, comfortable but confined, moving her between one northern house and another, always with attendants, always with guards, always under watch. It was called hospitality. Everyone understood what it actually was. The settlement that William Cecil had so carefully constructed was about to acquire its most dangerous test. Somewhere in the English north, in rooms hung with tapestries and attended by loyal servants, a figurehead was waiting. And across the channel, men with plans were already watching her window. The figurehead did not have to wait long. By the autumn of 1569, two of England's most powerful northern magnates had made their decision. Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland, and Charles Neville, the 6th Earl of Westmoreland, were men of ancient Catholic families whose local authority stretched back generations. To them, the old faith was not merely religion. It was identity, architecture, the very grain of the North. And in the captive Scottish queen, they saw something irresistible, a cause. On the 14th of November, 1569, they rode into Durham with hundreds of armed men at their backs. The cathedral doors swung open. The Protestant communion tables were overturned and scattered. The English prayer books were torn apart on the stone floor. And then, in that great vaulted space, the rebel earls celebrated the Latin Mass, the forbidden rite, the old words rising through incense smoke towards ceilings that had heard them for centuries. For those present, it must have felt like the restoration of an entire world. The plan was straightforward enough. March south, free Mary Stuart from her confinement, raise the Catholic population of England behind them, and force Elizabeth either to restore the old faith or face a war she could not win. The march began, and then, almost immediately, it faltered. The support they had counted on did not materialize. The Catholic gentry of the Midlands, cautious and calculating, stayed behind their own walls. The broader English population, whatever its private religious sympathies, did not rise. Mary herself was moved further south before the rebels could reach her. Without their figurehead, without the mass uprising they had promised themselves, the earls faced a stark arithmetic. Their army, perhaps 5,000 strong at its peak, was not enough. Royal forces were mobilizing. By December, the rebellion had simply dissolved. The men drifting home through the cold northern fields, the earls fleeing across the border into Scotland. It had lasted barely 6 weeks. Elizabeth's response was deliberate and merciless. She had been genuinely frightened, not something she admitted easily. Now she intended that fear to serve a purpose. Her instructions to the commanders sent north were explicit. Over 600 men were hanged in the villages and market towns of the north, a number chosen specifically to ensure that almost every community bore visible, public evidence of what rebellion cost. The bodies were left on display. The lesson was meant to be legible to anyone passing through. The earls themselves escaped immediate justice. Northumberland was eventually handed over by the Scottish regent and beheaded at York in 1572. Westmoreland died in exile on the continent, dependent on Spanish charity. What had the Northern Rising actually demonstrated? It had confirmed Elizabeth's deepest anxieties and Cecil's darkest assessments. The Catholic threat was not only external, arriving on Spanish galleons or in papal pronouncements from Rome. It lived in England itself, in the old families of the old counties, nourished by decades of quiet resentment. And at the center of that threat, comfortable and dangerous in her genteel captivity, sat Mary Stuart. Pope Pius V drew his own conclusions. In February of 1570, just weeks after the rebellion's collapse, he issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis. Elizabeth, he declared, was a heretic and a usurper. Her subjects were formally released from their allegiance to her. The secret war had just changed its nature entirely. What had been a contest of politics and diplomacy now carried, for every Catholic in England, the weight of a direct command from Rome. The question of loyalty had been made impossible to avoid. The document that changed everything was not lengthy. It ran to fewer than 1,000 words in its original Latin. But its implications would echo through England for decades, shaping the lives and deaths of hundreds of men and women who may never have read a single line of it. Michele Ghislieri had become Pope Pius V in 1566. He was a Dominican friar of austere habits and absolute convictions, a man who had served as Inquisitor General and carried that office's severity into everything he did. Where previous popes had pursued Elizabeth through cautious diplomacy, calculating the political costs of confrontation, Pius saw moral compromise where others saw strategy. The Northern Rising had convinced him that English Catholics were ready to act. He was wrong, but the bull was already being drafted. Regnans in Excelsis, meaning reigning on high, was issued on the 25th of February, 1570. Its language was extraordinary even by the standards of papal authority. Elizabeth was named a heretic and an obstacle to true religion. She was declared excommunicate, cut off from the body of the Church. And then came the sentence that transformed English Catholic life overnight. Her subjects were formally released from their allegiance to her. Any who continued to obey her commands were themselves threatened with excommunication. With a single document, Pius had handed Elizabeth's government exactly what it needed to justify everything that followed. The bull reached England through unofficial channels. John Felton, a wealthy Catholic gentleman living in London, obtained a copy and on the 25th of May, nailed it to the gate of the Bishop of London's residence in St. Paul's Churchyard. It was a gesture of remarkable and suicidal courage. Felton was arrested within hours, tortured in the Tower, and executed in August of that year. He died, by contemporary accounts, with complete composure. Before his death, he sent Elizabeth one of his rings. What Pius had failed to understand, or had simply not cared about, was the trap he had built for ordinary English Catholics. These were people who had, for the most part, navigated the Elizabethan religious settlement with quiet ingenuity, attending the required Protestant services while practicing their faith privately, loyal to their queen even as they clung to their rosaries. Regnans in Excelsis abolished that careful equilibrium. If they obeyed Elizabeth, they defied the Pope. If they obeyed the Pope, they were traitors. There was no middle ground left to stand on. Elizabeth's fury was genuine and her response was swift. Within 2 years, Parliament had passed legislation making it treason to bring papal bulls into England and treason to call the Queen a heretic. The fines for recusancy, for refusing to attend Protestant services, were dramatically increased. The machinery of suspicion that Cecil had been quietly assembling now had statutory teeth. The irony was profound. For the first decade of her reign, Elizabeth had resisted pressure from her more zealous Protestant advisors to pursue Catholics aggressively. She had no desire, she said, to make windows into men's souls. But Pius had made that restraint politically impossible. Every Catholic in England was now, in the eyes of the law, a potential instrument of foreign subversion. The distinction between private faith and political loyalty, always fragile, had been formally erased by the man who claimed to be Christ's representative on earth. Regnans in Excelsis achieved almost nothing it intended. It did not topple Elizabeth. It did not free Mary Stuart. It did not inspire a fresh Catholic uprising. What it did instead was radicalize the conflict, transforming what had been a political struggle into something that felt, to those caught within it, like an existential war. The Pope had fired his most powerful weapon, and it had landed squarely on the people he claimed to be protecting. In Rome and Madrid, the strategists of the Counter-Reformation were already drawing different conclusions. If English Catholics could not rise unaided, then they would need to be led. And that meant sending men directly into the heart of the enemy, trained, ordained, and prepared to die for the faith they carried. The age of the missionary priests was about to begin. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a figure almost comically ill-suited to the world of espionage. Roberto Ridolfi was a Florentine banker, urbane and gregarious, a man who moved through London's merchant networks with practiced ease. He had lived in England since 1562, cultivating relationships with Catholic nobles and foreign ambassadors alike. He was also, as English intelligence would eventually discover, a Vatican agent who had been communicating with Rome for years. By 1571, Ridolfi had conceived something breathtaking in its ambition. He envisioned a coordinated plot connecting three of the most powerful forces in the Catholic world: Pope Pius V, King Philip II of Spain, and the English Catholic nobility. The plan was simple in outline and catastrophic in detail. Spanish troops commanded by the Duke of Alba, stationed in the Netherlands, would land on English soil. English Catholics, led by prominent nobles, would rise to meet them. Elizabeth would be deposed or killed. And Mary, Queen of Scots, still a prisoner in England after 3 years of captivity, would be placed upon the throne, married to the most powerful Catholic nobleman in England, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk was a strange choice for revolutionary conspirator. He was England's only duke, proud of his ancient lineage and acutely conscious of his position. He had already been briefly imprisoned in 1569 for contemplating marriage to Mary without Elizabeth's permission. Released and apparently chastened, he had returned to royal favor. But the correspondence between Norfolk and Mary had never entirely stopped. Ridolfi exploited that connection with ruthless efficiency, persuading the Duke that the plot was inevitable, glorious, and safe. It was none of these things. Ridolfi made his fatal error in trusting too widely. Traveling between Rome, Madrid, and Brussels to secure commitments from Philip and the Pope, he left behind a trail of letters, ciphers, and coded messages that stretched across Europe. Cecil's agents, now operating a sophisticated interception network, began pulling threads. A cipher letter was discovered being carried by one of Norfolk's servants, a man named Charles Bally, at the port of Dover. Under interrogation, the network unraveled with almost indecent speed. By autumn of 1571, the full dimensions of the conspiracy were laid bare. Norfolk was arrested and taken to the Tower. Philip of Spain, when confronted with evidence of his involvement through diplomatic channels, offered polished denials. Ridolfi himself, already safely on the continent, was never returned to England. He lived out his days in Florence, eventually becoming a senator, one of history's more improbable survivors. Norfolk had no such luck. His trial in January of 1572 was swift, and the verdict was never in doubt. He was convicted of high treason and executed on Tower Hill in June of that year, the first nobleman to lose his head in Elizabeth's reign. The secret war had drawn its first blood from the English aristocracy. Parliament responded to the plot with volcanic anger, and much of that fury aimed itself at Mary Stuart. Here was the woman in whose name men had already died twice, and who sat in comfortable captivity writing coded letters to foreign conspirators. Demands for her execution were thunderous and nearly unanimous. Elizabeth refused. Her reasons mixed sentiment with strategy. She would not, she said, execute an anointed queen on the basis of letters she claimed were forged or misrepresented. But there was also calculation. Mary alive was a problem Elizabeth could manage. Mary martyred might become something far more dangerous, a rallying point that outlasted any living conspirator. It was a decision Elizabeth would revisit for 15 more years at enormous cost. But the question of what to do with the Scottish Queen would have to wait. From the seminaries of France and Rome, a different kind of soldier was preparing to cross the Channel. While Elizabeth's government hunted conspirators in the shadows of London's merchant houses and noble estates, a quieter battle was being prepared across the Channel. It had no swords, no cipher letters, no Florentine bankers moving through royal courts. It had only books, prayers, and the cold certainty of men who believed they were training to die. The man behind it was William Allen, an Oxford-educated priest from Lancashire who had left England in 1561 rather than conform to the new Protestant settlement. Allen was not a bitter exile consumed by personal grievance. He was something more dangerous, a visionary. He believed, with complete and unwavering conviction, that England's separation from Rome was a temporary wound, and that the right men, trained in the right way, could heal it. In 1568, Allen founded the English College at Douai, a Flemish university town under Spanish rule, and its purpose was revolutionary in its simplicity. He would take young English Catholics, men who had fled religious persecution or simply sought a Catholic education unavailable at home, and forge them into priests. Not comfortable parish priests expecting a settled life of sacraments and sermons, but missionaries. Men who understood from the first day of their formation that returning to England meant risking arrest, torture, and execution. The curriculum reflected this reality with remarkable frankness. Students studied scripture, theology, and controversy, learning to defend Catholic doctrine against Protestant arguments with precision and without flinching. They learned to celebrate Mass in secret, to hear confessions in whispered minutes, to move through hostile territory leaving no trace. The spiritual preparation woven through every aspect of their training was equally deliberate. They meditated on martyrdom not as a remote possibility, but as a probable destination. The stories of early Christian martyrs were not ancient history at Douai. They were a roadmap. Who were these young men? They came largely from England's recusant gentry, families who had quietly refused to attend Protestant services and paid the fines rather than abandon their faith. Many were educated, articulate, fluent in the languages of theological debate. Some were barely out of their adolescence when they arrived, their idealism still sharp and unweathered by the compromises of adult life. They had grown up watching their families diminished, their priests hunted, their religion driven into priest holes and hidden chapels. Douai gave their grievance a purpose. By the 1570s, the college was sending its graduates back across the Channel in small numbers, furnished with false identities and carried by Catholic networks of extraordinary courage. They traveled as tutors, merchants, gentlemen of leisure. Behind that disguise, they moved from manor house to manor house, saying Mass for families who had not received the sacraments in years, baptizing children, hearing confessions, dying well when they were caught. And they were caught. Elizabethan intelligence, sharpened by the Rodolphi crisis, tracked the seminary priests with grim efficiency. But for every priest taken, Douai trained another. The college itself was not immune to disruption. In 1578, political instability in the Spanish Netherlands forced Allen to move his enterprise to Reims in France, where it continued its work under the protection of the Guise family. 3 years later, in 1579, Allen secured a second foundation in the Eternal City itself. The English College in Rome, housed steps from the Vatican, would produce some of the most formidable missionaries of the coming decades. Allen himself rose with the institution he had built. He would eventually become a cardinal, the Vatican's most prominent English voice, the man Rome turned to when it needed someone who understood Elizabeth's England from the inside out. But in the late 1560s, he was simply a Lancashire priest with a borrowed building, a handful of students, and a belief that faith could outlast policy. He was not entirely wrong. What he had created at Douai was not merely a seminary. It was the infrastructure of resistance, and within a decade it would deliver to England's shores 2 men whose names would echo through the secret war with particular force. They came ashore at night, mostly. A fishing boat nudging against a Kent or Sussex beach, a figure stepping onto English soil for the first time in years, carrying nothing remarkable. A gentleman's coat. A servant's rough wool. Beneath the floorboards of a merchant vessel, tucked inside a false-bottomed trunk, vestments and a portable chalice wrapped in oilcloth. Everything required to bring the Mass back to England, hidden in the space between one world and another. The logistics were extraordinary in their precision. Catholic networks on both sides of the channel maintained contact through trusted merchants, sympathetic sea captains, and family connections that stretched from Flemish ports to English manor houses. A priest arriving at Calais or Boulogne would receive his alias, his cover story, his first contact address. He would cross as Thomas Harrington, merchant, or Edward Shelley, gentleman returning from his travels. The false names were carefully chosen, common enough to raise no suspicion, supported by papers that could survive a cursory examination at the docks. Once inland, the priest moved along a chain of Catholic safe houses, most of them the homes of recusant gentry who had quietly refused conformity for years. These households understood the risk with perfect clarity. Harboring a priest carried the penalty of death. And yet the doors opened. The women of these households deserve particular recognition. It was often the lady of the manor, not her husband, who managed the practical machinery of concealment. She knew which servants could be trusted, where the priest hole was hidden behind the paneling, how long a visitor could stay before the neighbors grew curious. She organized the quiet gatherings, the whispered masses said before dawn in a candlelit upper room. She kept the faith alive in the silences between visits, teaching her children the prayers, maintaining the rosaries, preserving what the law was trying to extinguish. The priests moved through. The women stayed, and staying required its own particular courage. For the missionary priest himself, the life was one of perpetual motion and perpetual vigilance. He might say Mass in 3 different counties within a fortnight, sleeping in attics and behind false walls, eating whatever the household could provide, always listening for the sound of horses in the lane. The sacraments he carried meant everything to the families he served. Children baptized in secret. Marriages blessed. The dying given last rites that the law forbade. He was, in every practical sense, a ghost, present, and then gone, leaving behind only the memory of something restored. But ghosts could be caught. In 1577, the Elizabethan authorities made that point with lethal clarity. Cuthbert Maine, a seminary priest from Douai, was arrested at Golden Manor in Cornwall, the home of his protector Francis Trajan. The evidence against him was damning enough by the standards of the new treason laws. He carried an Agnus Dei, a papal document, and the vestments of a Catholic priest. He was tried at Launceston, convicted, and executed with the full savagery the law prescribed. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. His head was set on a pole as a warning. Maine was the first of the seminary priests to die for his mission. He would not be the last. His execution sent a message to every Catholic household in England, and to every young man still studying at Douai or Rome. The government was serious. The stakes were absolute. And still the boats came, night after night, season after season. Because on the other side of that crossing, waiting with something approaching desperation, were English families who had not heard Mass in years. What happened when the most sophisticated network of missionaries yet conceived collided with Elizabeth's most formidable instrument of state power? That question would find its answer in the arrival of two men in particular, whose names had already become legend before they ever set foot on English soil. The man who would become Elizabeth's most feared servant arrived at his post without fanfare. Francis Walsingham took up his role as principal secretary in December of 1573, thin, perpetually dressed in black, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man who had spent his life expecting the worst. He had learned to expect it early. When Mary I had restored Catholicism to England in 1553, the young Walsingham was among the Protestant exiles who fled to the continent rather than conform. He studied in Padua, moved through the Protestant communities of Basel and Strasbourg, and absorbed something that would define everything he later became. He saw, with his own eyes, how Catholic Europe organized itself, how information moved, how networks of loyalty and obligation could stretch across borders and maintain their coherence for years. He was a student of power, and Europe was his classroom. He returned to England under Elizabeth with convictions hammered hard by exile. Protestantism was not, for Walsingham, a matter of convenience or politics. It was the absolute truth, and its enemies were absolutely real. When he looked at the missionary networks threading priests through English manor houses, he did not see a religious controversy. He saw war. His entire career would proceed from that recognition. What Elizabeth acquired when she appointed him was something England had never formally possessed: a spy service. Not the informal networks of informants that previous regimes had employed, but a systematic, funded, professionally managed intelligence apparatus. Walsingham had seen enough of continental statecraft to understand what such a thing could accomplish. He set about building one from the ground up, largely at his own considerable expense. The geography of his network was the geography of threat. Agents were placed in the French and Spanish courts, in the Habsburg territories, in the ports of Lisbon, Antwerp, and Venice. Sympathetic Protestant merchants reported the movements of shipping. English exiles, sometimes genuine, sometimes cultivated by Walsingham himself, moved through the Catholic communities of Rome and Paris. Most ambitiously of all, he placed men inside the English seminaries on the continent, young men trusted by the Jesuit fathers, known to their fellow students, and reporting in cipher back to London. The cipher room in Walsingham's household was, for its time, a marvel of applied intelligence. Thomas Phillips, his most gifted cryptographer, could break virtually any substitution cipher then in use and, when necessary, reseal a letter with such precision that its recipient would notice nothing. Correspondence between Catholic conspirators passed through Phillips' hands, was copied and decoded, and then moved on as though untouched. The recipients wrote back. The network continued, unaware that every confidence it shared was being read in a house on Seething Lane in London. Walsingham's guiding philosophy was expressed in a phrase he used more than once, with the quiet certainty of a man who had paid for the lesson himself. Knowledge is never too dear. Whatever intelligence cost in money or in the moral complexity of deception, the price was worth paying. He funded his operations out of personal funds when the Crown's support fell short, which it often did. He died in 1590 deeply in debt, a detail that tells you almost everything about the nature of his commitment. What drove him, beyond Protestant conviction, was the specific and personal weight of 1572. In that year, Walsingham had been serving as Elizabeth's ambassador in Paris when the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre swept through the city. Thousands of Protestants slaughtered in the streets over a single August weekend. He had sheltered refugees in the English embassy. He had watched a city he knew consumed by confessional violence. The massacre confirmed everything he had ever believed about the intentions of Catholic Europe toward Protestant England. Elizabeth was not simply a queen to be protected. She was the shield behind which the Reformed faith survived. Every agent he recruited, every letter he opened, every cipher his men cracked served that single purpose. The network of priests moving through English manor houses was real, and it was growing. To meet it, Walsingham would need more than surveillance. He would need a trap. The trap, when it came, was built from law as much as from espionage. In 1581, Parliament passed a statute of breathtaking severity. To reconcile any English subject to the Catholic Church, or to be reconciled oneself, was now defined as high treason. The penalty was death. A priest who heard a confession, administered a sacrament, or simply spoke persuasively of Rome's authority over English souls had committed, in the eyes of English law, an act equivalent to plotting the Queen's murder. The legal mechanism was in place. All that remained was to use it. The financial machinery operated alongside the gallows. Catholic recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services as the law required, had faced fines before. After 1581, those fines became ruinous. £20 per month for non-attendance, at a time when a skilled craftsman might earn £20 in an entire year. For gentry families with estates to protect, the calculation was brutal. Conform, or watch your inheritance drain away into the Crown's treasury. Many families tried to split the difference, sending one member to church while others quietly maintained the old faith. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing. But the most intimate instrument of the new severity was not a statute. It was a room beneath the Tower of London, and the sounds that came from it. The rack stretched its subjects horizontally, binding wrists and ankles to rollers that could be turned to elongate the body until joints separated and ligaments tore. The manacles suspended a prisoner by the wrists from a wall, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, the weight of the body doing the work that the torturer's hands need not. The scavenger's daughter did the opposite, folding a man into a compressed crouch until blood forced itself from the nose and ears. Each instrument had its practitioners, its procedures, its careful gradations of application. Into this world stepped Richard Topcliffe. If Walsingham provided the architecture of the persecution, Topcliffe inhabited it with a personal enthusiasm that disturbed even his employers. A member of Parliament, a gentleman by birth, he was also, without question, the most feared man in Catholic England. He hunted priests with the focused energy of a man who had found his true vocation, cultivating informers in Catholic households, tracking the movements of Jesuit missionaries across the country, and conducting interrogations in a private torture chamber at his own home in Westminster, a detail that says something remarkable about his relationship with the Crown's authority. He wrote to Elizabeth directly, with a familiarity that suggests she tolerated, and perhaps valued, his excesses. The priests he caught were tried in the common law courts, and here the legal fiction that defined the entire persecution came into its sharpest focus. Edmund Campion, the brilliant Jesuit scholar arrested in 1581 after being dragged from a priest hole in Berkshire, was not charged with saying Mass. He was charged with conspiring to murder the Queen. The evidence was, at best, inferential. The outcome was not in doubt. Campion was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn in December of that year, and Elizabeth's government insisted to anyone who would listen that England executed traitors, not martyrs. It was a distinction Rome was not inclined to accept. The fiction served a purpose. It allowed England to maintain before the courts of European opinion that this was a matter of political loyalty, not religious conscience. Every executed priest was, officially, a man who had chosen subversion over obedience. What it could not do was prevent those priests from dying with extraordinary composure, speaking to the crowds gathered at the scaffold, and in doing so, generating precisely the martyrologies the government feared most. The war for souls was also, increasingly, a war for memory. And memory, as Elizabeth's advisors were beginning to understand, was very difficult to execute. The decision was made in Rome in the spring of 1580, inside the walls of the English College. The Society of Jesus, barely 4 decades old and already the most formidable religious order in Christendom, would send its finest minds into the most dangerous mission field in Europe. Not the jungles of Brazil, not the imperial courts of Japan. England. 2 men were chosen. Robert Persons was a pragmatist, an organizer, a man who understood logistics and survival. Edmund Campion was something rarer. A former Oxford scholar who had once delivered a ceremonial address so brilliant that Queen Elizabeth herself had praised it. He had since fled England, found his way to Rome, and been ordained into the society. He was, by any measure, the most gifted Catholic intellectual of his generation. He was also, by temperament, a man utterly incapable of hiding his light. They arrived separately on the English coast in June of 1580, traveling in disguise, Campion posing as a jewel merchant. The country they re-entered had been transformed since Campion's Oxford years. Walsingham's network of informers had penetrated Catholic households across the southern counties. Every port had its watchers. Every stranger attracted scrutiny. To be a priest in England in 1580 was to live inside a perpetual ambush. And yet Campion wrote, within months of his arrival, he had composed a letter intended for the Privy Council, to be opened only if he were captured. He called it his brag, and the title was perfectly chosen. It was defiant, eloquent, and utterly without self-pity. He declared that he had come to preach the gospel, that he feared no earthly authority, and that he challenged the Queen's finest scholars to debate him openly on matters of theology. He was confident, he wrote, that truth would prevail. The letter circulated in manuscript long before his arrest, copied by hand through Catholic networks, read in secret parlors across England, and eventually printed abroad. It made him famous. It also made him the most wanted man in the kingdom. For more than a year, Campion moved. Through Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Lancashire, across the Midland counties where old Catholic families maintained their faith behind carefully managed appearances. He traveled at night. He said Mass in priest holes, those ingeniously concealed chambers that craftsmen had begun building into Catholic manor houses, spaces tucked behind false walls and beneath staircases, sometimes no larger than a wardrobe. He argued, preached, and administered sacraments to families who had not heard a Catholic priest in years. He also remarkably continued to write, continued a major theological work called De Sem Rationis, 10 Reasons for the Truth of Catholicism, which was secretly printed and distributed at the Oxford University commencement in 1581. The audacity was breathtaking. The government was furious. Walsingham tightened the net with methodical patience. Informers were placed. Houses were watched. The network of pursuivants, professional priest hunters authorized to search private homes, fanned across the Catholic counties. The reward for Campion's capture circulated quietly through the underworld of informers and opportunists that Walsingham had cultivated with such care. The remarkable thing, looking back across the centuries, is how long Campion survived. His mission lasted 14 months. 14 months of clandestine masses, narrow escapes, and relentless movement through a country that was actively hunting him. It speaks to the depth of Catholic loyalty that so many households sheltered him at enormous personal risk for so long. But every net, drawn tightly enough, eventually closes. The manhunt that had consumed Walsingham's resources for over a year was about to reach its end, and what followed would test the government's carefully maintained fictions to their breaking point. They found him on July 17, 1581, hidden in a priest hole at Lyford Grange in Berkshire. A former servant turned informer had led the pursuivants to the house. The concealed chamber had kept Campion safe through 2 days of searching, but the hunters were patient. When they finally pulled him from the darkness, blinking and cramped, the most wanted priest in England offered no resistance. He had always known somewhere beneath the bravado of his brag that it would end this way. He was taken to London on horseback, his arms bound, a paper pinned to his hat reading "Campion the Seditious Jesuit." Crowds gathered along the road to stare. Some jeered. Others wept quietly and looked away. The Tower of London received him within days. And there, in the cold lower chambers, the rack was waiting. Elizabeth's government faced a precise problem. Campion was famous across Europe. His death, if it came too quickly and too clumsily, would produce exactly the martyr the Vatican desired. The solution was to break him first, to have him recant or confess to treason, or at least appear diminished and compliant before the public gaze. He was racked multiple times. His interrogators pushed hard for names, for the locations of Catholic networks, for evidence of treasonous conspiracy with foreign powers. Campion gave them almost nothing of practical value. When physical coercion failed, the government tried intellectual humiliation. Campion, his body still damaged from torture, was brought before a series of Protestant divines for public disputation. He had, after all, challenged England's scholars to debate him openly. Now they would take him up on that offer, on their own terms, with no time to prepare, with his hands shaking and his health broken. The sessions were designed to produce a public defeat. They did not entirely succeed. Witnesses noted that even weakened and unprepared, Campion argued with striking force. The government stopped the disputations after 4 rounds. The trial, held in November of 1581, was a formality wearing the costume of justice. The charge was treason, specifically a conspiracy to assassinate the Queen, an allegation for which the evidence was, by any honest measure, non-existent. Campion denied it with complete consistency. It made no difference. The verdict was predetermined, the jury compliant, the outcome never seriously in question. He was found guilty. On December 1st, 1581, Edmund Campion was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn before a large crowd. He was 41 years old. Witnesses recorded that he prayed aloud for the Queen as he stood on the scaffold, expressing, to the end, no hostility toward the woman whose government was killing him. It was precisely the kind of gesture that made him impossible to dismiss as a traitor in any meaningful sense. The propaganda war began before the blood had dried. The government maintained, and would continue to maintain, that Campion had died for political conspiracy, not religious belief. Rome and the Catholic printing houses of Europe answered with a flood of martyrology. Within weeks, his execution had been printed, distributed, and transformed into devotional literature across France, Spain, and the Low Countries. The question of whether Campion was a martyr or a traitor was, in truth, a question about who controlled the definition of treason. Elizabeth's government had made it treasonous to be a Catholic priest in England. By that law, Campion was guilty from the moment he stepped ashore in 1580. Everything else was theater. His death did not break the Catholic mission. It accelerated it, drawing more volunteers to the English College in Rome and hardening the resolve on both sides of a conflict that was rapidly outgrowing the boundaries of theology altogether. Campion's execution had made one thing terrifyingly clear to every Catholic household in England. To shelter a priest was to risk everything. And yet, they kept doing it. The question was how? The answer came, in large part, from one small, physically unimposing man whose name almost no one knew. Nicholas Owen was a Jesuit lay brother and a carpenter by trade, the son of an Oxford craftsman, slight enough in frame that he could squeeze himself into spaces other men could not imagine inhabiting. Beginning in the 1580s and continuing for nearly 2 decades, he traveled from manor house to manor house across England, arriving quietly, departing without ceremony, and leaving behind something extraordinary inside the walls. He built priest holes. But that phrase understates the achievement considerably. Owen's constructions were works of genuine engineering genius. He understood that a simple hidden room was not enough. Pursuivants had been searching houses for years. They carried measuring rods and tapped walls listening for hollow sound. They counted paces outside a building and inside, looking for discrepancies. They pulled up floorboards. They probed chimneys with iron rods. Owen designed against all of it. At Harvington Hall in Worcestershire, he created a system of multiple hides, each concealed in a different architectural layer of the house, with false floors, concealed ladders, and spaces tucked behind genuine structural elements so that no single search could reveal them all. At Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, he converted the sewer channels beneath the house into a refuge accessible through trapdoors in the floors above. Priests crouched in the darkness below while searchers walked overhead. The experience of hiding was, by all surviving accounts, an ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance. A priest might remain motionless in a space barely large enough to contain a crouching body for 3 days, sometimes 4, listening to the sound of hammers breaking through plaster in the rooms above. No light. Limited air. No certainty that the space would hold or that an informer had not already provided a map. Some hides were not discovered for centuries. One at Harvington was found only in 1977. Owen had built them to last. He was captured in January of 1606 during the government's furious sweep following the gunpowder plot, though Owen himself had no involvement in that conspiracy. He was taken to the Tower, and what followed was methodical and brutal. The authorities understood exactly who they had. Here was the man who knew the location of every hide he had ever built. They racked him repeatedly, and when he died in March of 1606, the official account claimed suicide. Almost no one believed it. He had given up nothing. The Catholic Church would eventually canonize Nicholas Owen in 1970 as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. But the truest measure of his achievement was simpler. Dozens of priests survived because of his hands. And the pursuit was about to grow even more desperate on both sides. While Nicholas Owen labored in silence behind the walls of English manor houses, a very different kind of architecture was taking shape across the Channel. Not in stone and timber, but in ink, cipher, and human loyalty bought at considerable price. By the mid-1580s, Francis Walsingham had built something England had never possessed before: a professional intelligence network. Woven across the courts and port cities of Europe, it answered to one man, operated in permanent shadow, and never appeared in any official government ledger by its true name. The scale of it was remarkable. Historians estimate that Walsingham maintained more than 50 agents operating abroad at any given time. They sat in the antechambers of the Vatican. They moved through the merchant houses of Antwerp. They drank in the taverns of Paris, where exiled English Catholics gathered to dream of restoration. Each one fed information back through carefully arranged channels, the details passing through multiple hands before arriving, decoded and annotated, on Walsingham's desk in London. At the center of this machinery sat a young man named Thomas Phillips. Thin, pockmarked, reportedly nearsighted, Phillips possessed one of the most remarkable analytical minds of the 16th century. He was Walsingham's master codebreaker, capable of cracking the substitution ciphers favored by Catholic conspirators with what contemporaries described as almost unsettling speed. But decryption was only half his gift. Phillips could also forge. He could replicate a man's handwriting closely enough to deceive that man's closest associates, a talent that would soon prove devastating to the very people it targeted. The interception of diplomatic mail was another of Walsingham's innovations, or at least his most systematic deployment of it. Courier routes were mapped. Trusted carriers were turned. Letters arriving at English ports were quietly removed, carried to Phillips, copied or decoded, resealed with such care that recipients noticed nothing, and then sent on their way. The Vatican's correspondence with its English supporters passed through Walsingham's hands with a regularity that gave him an almost prophetic awareness of Catholic intentions. But perhaps the most ruthless instrument in his collection was the double agent. Gilbert Gifford arrived in England in December of 1585, presenting himself to Catholic networks as a committed servant of the cause. He was, in fact, working directly for Walsingham. Gifford's particular assignment would bear fruit that exceeded even his handler's expectations, though that story would reach its conclusion the following year. What mattered was the principle he embodied. The most dangerous spy is not the one who steals your secrets. It is the one you trust completely. None of this came cheaply. Walsingham was spending money at a rate that genuinely alarmed the royal treasury. He is believed to have spent somewhere in the range of £2,000 annually on intelligence operations, a staggering sum for the period, and one that Elizabeth's government was chronically reluctant to fully reimburse. By the final years of his life, Walsingham was funding significant portions of the network from his own fortune. He died in 1590 with debts so severe that his family buried him at night to avoid creditors seizing his estate. He had spent himself, quite literally, in service of the Queen who never fully thanked him. The web he built was about to catch something extraordinary. Inside the Catholic exile community, a young Scottish queen sitting under house arrest in an English manor had begun corresponding with her supporters using a cipher she believed was unbreakable. She had no idea that every letter passed directly through Thomas Phillips's practiced hands. By the time Gilbert Gifford was settling into his double life, Walsingham had already survived one major conspiracy that most of England had scarcely heard about. The Throckmorton plot, uncovered in 1583, had come within reach of unraveling everything Elizabeth had built across 25 years of careful rule. Francis Throckmorton was 29 years old, a well-connected Catholic gentleman from a prominent family. He had spent time on the continent, moved in the right circles, and returned to England carrying something far more dangerous than luggage. He had become the living link between Mary Stuart, the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza, and the network of Catholic exiles dreaming of invasion. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. Spanish forces, coordinated with a French Catholic army under the Duke of Guise, would land on English shores. Sympathetic English Catholics would rise in support. Elizabeth would be deposed. Mary would take the throne. The Vatican had offered its blessing, its encouragement, and its expectation of a restored Catholic England as the prize. Throckmorton's role was to carry letters between these parties, cycling between Mendoza's London residence and the coded correspondence of the imprisoned Scottish Queen. He kept detailed notes, lists of English Catholic noblemen who might be counted upon, harbor charts marking suitable landing points for invasion fleets, damning documents for anyone to possess. Walsingham was watching him for months before moving. This patience was deliberate. The intelligence chief understood that arresting a courier too early meant capturing one man while the network scattered. He waited, allowing Throckmorton to reveal the full shape of the conspiracy, mapping every connection before pulling the thread. In November of 1583, the arrest came. Throckmorton managed to destroy some documents in the moments before his captors secured his house, but not enough. The harbor charts survived. The lists of sympathizers survived. Under torture on the rack at the Tower of London, he confessed in detail, naming names, describing the coordination between Madrid, Rome, and the exile community in France. His execution followed in July of 1584, the machinery of Elizabethan justice grinding forward with its customary brutality. But the consequences extended beyond one man's death. Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador who had operated from the heart of London as a willing conspirator against the Queen he was officially accredited to serve, was summoned before the Privy Council and expelled from England. He departed unrepentant, reportedly telling council members that since he had failed to satisfy the Queen as a minister of peace, he would try to satisfy her as a minister of war. He would spend the following years in Paris, continuing his work against Elizabeth from a safer distance. The Throckmorton plot had failed, but it confirmed something Elizabeth's advisors had long suspected. Spain, the Vatican, and the exile community were not independent threats. They were coordinating. They were patient. And they would try again. The shot that killed William of Orange on July 10, 1584, echoed far beyond the courtyard of his home in Delft. The most powerful Protestant leader in Europe, the man who had held the Netherlands together against Spanish occupation for over a decade, was dead. Balthasar Gerard had fired the pistol. The Pope had provided the inspiration. A papal bull had declared William an outlaw, offering reward and absolution to whoever removed him. Protestant Europe absorbed the news like a physical blow. If William could be killed in his own home, surrounded by his own people, what protection did any Protestant ruler have? The question arrived in London with particular force. Elizabeth's advisors needed no imagination to draw the obvious comparison. Walsingham had been warning for years that Elizabeth was a target. Now the warning had a face, a pistol, and a dead prince to prove it. Parliament did not wait to be convinced. The mood in England in the autumn of 1584 was not cautious or deliberative. It was frightened, and frightened men move quickly. What emerged was the Bond of Association, one of the most extraordinary documents in English legal history. It was not passed by Parliament in the first instance. It was written, circulated, and signed by private individuals, thousands of them, noblemen and commoners alike, pledging a solemn oath to hunt down and kill anyone who might benefit from Elizabeth's assassination. The logic was blunt. If murdering the Queen created a path to the throne for Mary Stuart, then Mary Stuart would not survive Elizabeth by a single day. The signatories would see to it personally, with or without legal sanction. It was stripped of its formal language, a vigilante contract, and the Queen allowed it. Parliament gave it statutory force the following year with the Act for the Queen's Safety in 1585. The law refined the oath's rougher edges, establishing that a commission would investigate any alleged conspiracy rather than leaving justice to mob action. But its core meaning remained unchanged. Mary, Queen of Scots, was now legally bound to her own good behavior by the lives of everyone who had signed. The noose around Mary was tightening from multiple directions. The Throckmorton plot had demonstrated her willingness to correspond with foreign powers. The bond of association had made her survival conditional on Elizabeth's. And Walsingham's intelligence operation was growing more sophisticated with every passing month. Mary remained imprisoned, moving between one English castle and another, still writing her carefully coded letters, still dreaming of rescue. She did not fully understand how completely her situation had changed. She was no longer simply a dangerous prisoner. She was now a liability that English law had specifically prepared to eliminate. The stage was being set, one careful piece at a time, for the final act. And Walsingham had one more trap to lay. By the spring of 1586, Francis Walsingham had spent years building toward a single moment. He needed Mary Stuart not merely suspected, not merely implicated by the testimony of others, but destroyed by her own hand. What he required was a letter, written in her own cipher, ordering the death of Elizabeth. He needed her signature on her own warrant. Anthony Babington gave him the opportunity. Babington was 24 years old, wealthy, charming, and consumed by the romantic idea of Catholic martyrdom. He had served briefly as a page to Mary's household years earlier and had never forgotten it. Around him clustered a group of young Catholic gentlemen, men of similar background and similar fervor, who met in London taverns and spoke in lowered voices about rescuing their imprisoned queen and removing the Protestant usurper from England's throne. Their plan had two parts. 6 men would assassinate Elizabeth. Others would simultaneously free Mary and raise a Catholic rebellion. It was passionate. It was detailed. It was almost entirely visible to Walsingham from its earliest stages. The architect of his surveillance was a young Catholic named Gilbert Gifford. Gifford had arrived in England in late 1585 carrying letters of introduction to Mary's supporters. He was arrested almost immediately and brought before Walsingham, who made him an offer he could not refuse. Gifford would become a courier, a bridge between Mary and the outside world, and every message that passed through him would pass first through Walsingham's office. The method Gifford established was elegant in its deception. Messages would be smuggled into Mary's prison at Chartley inside the waterproof bung of a beer barrel. Outgoing letters left the same way. Mary's jailers arranged the deliveries. Her supporters believed they had finally found a secure channel. They had delivered themselves into a perfect trap. Thomas Phillips, Walsingham's brilliant cryptanalyst, sat at his desk breaking Mary's ciphers with the patience and precision of a surgeon. Every letter was opened, decoded, copied, resealed, and sent on, as if untouched. Mary wrote freely, believing for the first time in years that she could communicate without detection. She had never been more closely watched in her life. In July of 1586, Babington wrote directly to Mary, describing the plot in extraordinary detail, including the plan for the 6 assassins. He asked for her blessing. He needed her to say yes. She said yes. Mary's reply, written on the 17th of July, did not merely acknowledge the plot. It offered strategic advice. It discussed the timing of the foreign invasion. It addressed the question of her own liberation. And it endorsed, with varying degrees of directness, the elimination of Elizabeth. When the decoded letter reached Phillips, he drew a small gallows symbol on the outside. The message required no further annotation. Walsingham waited. He wanted the entire network. He allowed the correspondence to continue a little longer, even adding a forged postscript to Mary's letter requesting the names of all 6 would-be assassins. Whether Babington recognized the forgery or simply grew frightened is uncertain, but he began to suspect exposure. In August, he fled London. The flight triggered the collapse of everything. The arrests came quickly. Babington and his associates were seized across London and the surrounding counties, dragged from hiding places and safe houses. Their confidence dissolved into terror. They were tried at Westminster in mid-September of 1586. The evidence against them was overwhelming, because Walsingham had collected every word they had ever written. Babington and the principal conspirators were executed with gruesome ceremony on the 18th of September, hanged but cut down while still living, the full brutality of the traitor's sentence applied in public view. Mary herself was arrested at Chartley. The beer barrels were silent now. Her coded letters, her elaborate ciphers, her careful plans, they had built not her freedom but her cage. She was to be tried. And for that, Walsingham and Elizabeth's council would need to decide exactly how far English law could reach when the prisoner in the dock was a queen. Fotheringhay Castle rose from the flat Northamptonshire countryside like a warning. In October of 1586, 46 commissioners rode there through autumn rain to sit in judgment on a queen. They gathered in the great hall beneath high windows, arranged in rows of chairs that framed a single seat covered in red velvet. The red seat was empty. It represented Elizabeth, absent but present in every word spoken in that room. Mary entered dressed in black velvet, walking with the aid of a staff, her health broken by nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. She had aged considerably, her hair now almost entirely gray beneath her white cap. But her bearing had not faltered. Whatever else the years had taken, they had not taken that. She challenged the court before a single piece of evidence had been presented. She was a sovereign queen, she declared, not an English subject. She had never sworn allegiance to Elizabeth's laws, and no earthly tribunal held jurisdiction over an anointed monarch. The argument was legally serious. Even some of the commissioners privately acknowledged it. But the court had been constructed precisely to circumvent it. The Act for the Queen's Safety, passed the previous year, had created this tribunal specifically to try persons of royal standing accused of conspiring against Elizabeth's life. The legal architecture had been built with Mary in mind. She denied everything. The letters, she insisted, were forgeries. Her ciphers had been stolen and manipulated. Walsingham's men had fabricated the most damning passages. She had never endorsed any plot to murder Elizabeth. She demanded to see the original letters. She demanded to confront her accusers face to face. Both requests were denied. What the court presented instead were the decoded transcriptions, the careful work of Phillips and his colleagues, combined with the confessions of Babington's associates and of Mary's own secretaries, Claude Now and Gilbert Curl. The secretaries had confirmed the letters' authenticity. Under pressure, they had given the court exactly what it needed. Mary, hearing this, reportedly fixed the commissioners with a look of absolute contempt. She called their testimony coerced. She may well have been right. It did not matter. The verdict had never genuinely been in question. On the 25th of October, the commissioners found Mary Stuart guilty of compassing and imagining divers matters tending to the hurt, death, and destruction of the royal person of Elizabeth. Parliament met shortly afterward and pressed loudly for her execution. The Protestant public, primed by years of Catholic conspiracy fears, agreed with equal volume. Only one voice remained uncertain. Elizabeth hesitated. The weeks that followed the verdict became some of the most agonizing of her reign. She signed the death warrant and then drew back from it. She asked her council whether Mary might simply be quietly removed, some private solution that would spare her the public act of executing a queen. No one would accept the commission. She wept, reportedly, in private audiences. She raged at her ministers for placing her in this position. The hesitation was real, but it was also complicated. Elizabeth understood what the execution of a monarch meant for the idea of monarchy itself. If queens could be tried and beheaded by the legal instruments of rival states, no throne in Europe was truly safe. She was setting a precedent she could not unset. And somewhere beneath the political calculation, there may have been something more personal. Whatever their enmity, Mary had been her cousin, her fellow queen, the other woman who had navigated a world built entirely for men. The warrant sat on her desk. Parliament waited. The Catholic powers of Europe watched. And across England, in the cold of a deepening winter, the executioner had not yet been summoned, but everyone knew he would be. The warrant was signed on the 1st of February, 1587. Elizabeth handed it to her Secretary of State, William Davison, with instructions that were, deliberately or not, ambiguous enough to be interpreted as she later needed them to be. Within days, the Privy Council had acted without informing her further. The order went north. Mary spent her final night in prayer and preparation. She wrote letters by candlelight until the small hours, composing careful words to the King of France, to her son James, to the Pope. She distributed her belongings among her servants with the precision of someone settling accounts, ensuring that those who had shared her long captivity would not be forgotten. She slept, by most accounts, very little. She did not weep. She entered the great hall at Fotheringhay Castle on the morning of February the 8th dressed in black, attended by her small household. Then she removed the black outer garments, and underneath she wore crimson, the color chosen with absolute deliberateness. It was the liturgical color of martyrdom in the Catholic tradition. She understood that she was not simply dying. She was constructing an image that would outlast the axe. Before the block, she prayed aloud in Latin, her voice steady enough to carry across the hall where some 300 witnesses had gathered to watch. The Protestant Dean of Peterborough attempted to offer Protestant prayers on her behalf. She silenced him, politely but completely, and continued in her own language, in her own faith. Her servants wept audibly. She told them, in French, not to grieve. She placed her head upon the block herself, without assistance. The first blow from the executioner, a man named Bull, was not clean. It struck the back of her head. The second severed it. The entire hall fell silent in a way that witnesses would describe for years afterward, a silence that seemed to press against the walls. Then came the moment that no one who was present ever forgot. The executioner reached down and lifted what he took to be her head to display to the crowd as custom required. And the auburn hair came away in his hand. The head fell. Beneath the wig, Mary's own hair was close cropped and almost entirely white. She was 44 years old. She had arranged even this final moment, knowing exactly how she would appear, knowing that the wig's revelation would be its own testament to the years of imprisonment that had aged and diminished her. A small dog was found hiding beneath her skirts. It refused to leave her body. When news reached Greenwich, Elizabeth's response confounded everyone around her and has occupied historians ever since. She collapsed into what appeared to be genuine grief, then pivoted into fury. Her anger fixed upon Davison, who had, she insisted, acted without proper authorization in forwarding the warrant. He was sent to the Tower. He was fined the ruinous sum of £10,000. His career was finished. Whether Elizabeth was truly deceived by her own counsel, or whether she had constructed the arrangement precisely to allow herself this escape remained unclear to those present, and remains unclear now. What was certain was that she needed someone to bear the weight of what had been done, and Davison was available. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent tremors through every Catholic court in Europe. Philip of Spain, who had been watching, calculating, and waiting, received the news in Madrid. He had already been assembling something in his harbors. Now he had the justification he had needed. The secret war was about to become something far less secret. Philip of Spain did not grieve for Mary, Queen of Scots. He calculated. He had been assembling his fleet for months before her head fell at Fotheringhay, but her death gave him something more valuable than a pretext. It gave him a cause that the Pope could bless without reservation. In Rome, Sixtus V received the news of the execution with barely concealed satisfaction. Here at last was the moment the Vatican had been waiting for. He pledged 1 million gold ducats to the enterprise, payable when Spanish troops actually set foot on English soil. It was a careful investment from a careful man. Heaven's blessing came first. The money would follow victory. The fleet that gathered in Lisbon Harbor in the spring of 1588 was unlike anything Europe had witnessed before. 130 ships, 7,000 sailors, 17,000 soldiers. Provisions for 6 months. The vessels carried papal banners alongside the flag of Spain, and every man aboard had received absolution before sailing. They called it the Enterprise of England. Their commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, called it a nightmare. He had written to Philip warning that he suffered from seasickness, had no naval experience, and believed the entire venture was likely to end in catastrophe. Philip sent him anyway. The Armada sailed in May of 1588, its objective clear. It would move up the Channel, rendezvous off the Flemish coast with the Duke of Parma's army of some 17,000 veteran troops, ferry them across to England, and march on London. Elizabeth would be deposed or killed. England would be returned to Rome. The plan required precise coordination between forces that could not reliably communicate with each other. It required favorable weather. It required everything to go right. Almost nothing went right. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Francis Drake as his vice-admiral, harried the Armada relentlessly up the Channel through late July. The Spanish formation held a tight defensive crescent, but it could not land, could not link up with Parma, and could not shake its pursuers. Then, anchored off Calais on the night of the 7th of August, the Spanish captains saw something they had dreaded. 8 fire ships, ablaze from bow to stern, came drifting toward them on the tide. The formation broke. Ships cut their anchor cables in panic and scattered into the open sea. The battle off Gravelines the following morning was the decisive engagement. English guns tore through Spanish hulls at close range. 5 Spanish ships were lost. The fleet, damaged and disorganized, could not return south through the Channel. Its only route home was north, around Scotland and Ireland, through some of the most violent waters in the world. The storms did the rest. Of the 130 ships that had sailed so confidently from Lisbon, fewer than 60 returned. Perhaps 20,000 men were lost. Wrecks scattered from the Hebrides to the coast of Connacht, and the Irish who came down to those beaches found them strewn with bodies and shattered timber and the remnants of a holy war. In England, the Protestant narrative assembled itself almost immediately. God had blown with his winds, and they were scattered. A commemorative medal was struck bearing exactly those words. Elizabeth rode before her troops at Tilbury and delivered words that entered the English language permanently. The Pope's crusade had broken on English shores, and Protestant Providence had done it. Spain would rebuild. Philip would try again. But something had shifted in the imagination of Europe. The secret war, waged for 3 decades through assassins and plots and excommunications, had finally declared itself openly, and England had survived. What that survival would cost, and what it had already cost in blood and conscience, was another question entirely. The Armada's wreckage had barely finished washing ashore when the persecution intensified. Victory, it turned out, did not bring mercy. Through the 1590s, Elizabeth's government hunted priests with a ferocity that exceeded anything seen in the previous 2 decades. The logic was simple and brutal. The seminary missions had continued year after year, slipping trained men across the Channel and into Catholic households. Every priest who survived represented a network of sheltered recusants, hidden rooms, false walls, and quiet defiance. The state's answer was to make survival impossible. Margaret Clitheroe had already paid the price before the decade began, pressed to death beneath a wooden door weighted with heavy stones in York in 1586, having refused to plead so that her children could not be called to testify against her. She was 30 years old. The men who killed her called it justice. Catholics called her the Pearl of York. Robert Southwell lasted longer. The Jesuit priest and poet spent years moving through England in disguise, writing verses of extraordinary delicacy while living under constant threat of capture. When they finally caught him in 1592, Richard Topcliffe, the most zealous and sadistic of Elizabeth's priest hunters, personally supervised his torture. Southwell endured 13 sessions before his execution in 1595. He was 33 years old. The same year Southwell died, Francis Walsingham had already been gone 5 years. He had died in 1590 in debt, his estate's mortgage to fund operations the Crown would not fully reimburse. But the apparatus he had built outlasted him. His successors inherited his networks, his methods, his informers embedded in Catholic households and on the continent. The machine kept running. And yet the Catholic cause was fracturing from within. By the late 1590s, a bitter dispute had opened between the Jesuit missionaries and the secular priests, men trained at Douai and Valladolid who had grown resentful of Jesuit influence and what they saw as Jesuit political adventurism. The seculars wanted accommodation with the Elizabethan state. The Jesuits, many of them, wanted nothing less than restoration. The appellant controversy, as it came to be called, was not merely a theological argument. It was a fight over survival strategy. The secular priests petitioned Rome to appoint an archpriest independent of Jesuit oversight. The dispute grew so bitter that some appellants actually approached the English government, offering information about Jesuit activities in exchange for tolerance. Catholics denouncing Catholics to Protestant authorities. Walsingham, had he lived to see it, might have smiled. By the close of the century, something had become undeniable. The great Catholic hope of reversing the English Reformation was fading. The seminary men had shown extraordinary courage. The recusant families had paid enormous fines and hidden their faith behind panelled walls. But England was not returning to Rome. The question now was what kind of peace, if any, the two sides could reach, and who would survive long enough to negotiate it. She had outlived almost everyone who had shaped her. Walsingham was gone. Cecil was gone. Leicester was gone. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth moved through a court populated by younger men she could not quite trust, wearing wigs to cover her thinning hair, her face heavily powdered, her temper shorter than it had ever been. The queen who had dazzled Europe for 4 decades was aging in public, and she knew it. She died on March the 24th, 1603, at Richmond Palace, having refused for weeks to eat or sleep properly, having reportedly sat for hours on cushions on the floor, declining to be moved. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 45 years. She left no direct heir and, in a final act of characteristic ambiguity, no written declaration of succession. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son. The child Elizabeth had never met, born of the woman she had executed. There was a bitter poetry in it that no dramatist could have improved upon. English Catholics permitted themselves a moment of cautious hope. James had a Catholic mother. His wife, Anne of Denmark, had converted quietly to Rome. Surely this king would be different. Surely the fines would ease, the priests would be tolerated, the long persecution would finally exhale. It did not. James had no interest in martyrs or missions. He wanted a quiet kingdom, and quiet meant conformity. By 1604, the recusancy fines were back in force. The brief window closed. What followed was desperation wearing the mask of conspiracy. In November of 1605, a group of Catholic gentlemen came within hours of detonating 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords, with James and his parliament inside. The gunpowder plot was not a sanctioned operation. Rome had nothing to do with it. But it was the final, catastrophic expression of the 40-year war between English Catholicism and the Protestant state, the last attempt to solve by violence what could not be solved by endurance. It failed. The conspirators were hunted down, tortured, and executed. And the consequences fell. as consequences always did on ordinary Catholics who had known nothing of it. Parliament responded with new penal laws of crushing severity. Those laws would not be fully repealed until 1829, more than 200 years after Elizabeth's death. That is the true measure of what the secret war had cost. Elizabeth and Pius V, Philip II, and Edmund Campion, the seminary priests and the priest hunters, the hidden rooms and the racked bodies, all of it had built walls that generations could not pull down. The conflict outlasted every one of its architects by centuries. England would not forget, and it would not entirely forgive. What does it mean to lose a secret war? There are no surrendered flags, no signed treaties, no monuments in public squares. The conflict between Elizabeth's England and the Vatican left behind something stranger than defeat or victory. It left behind mythology. In October of 1970, nearly 4 centuries after Edmund Campion climbed the scaffold at Tyburn, Pope Paul VI stood before a crowd in Rome and canonized 40 men and women who had died for their faith in England and Wales between 1535 and 1679. They were declared saints. Campion was among them. So was Margaret Clitheroe, pressed to death beneath a door weighted with stones in York in 1586. Ordinary people by most measures. A priest. A housewife. A scholar. All of them crushed by the machinery that Walsingham had helped to build. Rome had made them eternal. The machinery itself had also proved eternal in its own way. Walsingham's network of informers, his use of double agents, his practice of intercepting correspondence and breaking codes, his understanding that information was power more reliable than armies, all of it became the template for what followed. The intelligence services of the modern world trace their operational logic back to those methods. The tradecraft developed in the shadows of Elizabethan England, refined through the hunting of priests and the unmasking of plots, became the foundational grammar of espionage. Walsingham would have recognized a briefing room in Langley or Vauxhall Cross. The tools have changed. The principles have not. But the war left darker inheritances too. Anti-Catholic sentiment did not dissolve when the seminary priests stopped coming. It hardened into law and into instinct. Catholics were barred from Parliament, from universities, from public office. They could not vote. They could not bear arms. Generation after generation grew up in a country that treated their faith as a form of disloyalty, a fifth column waiting to be activated. That suspicion, seeded in the 1570s and watered by the Gunpowder Plot, persisted in British culture long after anyone could name its origins. Today, workers restoring Old English country houses still find them. Priest holes. Hidden behind paneling, beneath staircases, inside chimney breasts. Spaces barely large enough for a man to fold himself into and breathe. Some still contain the traces of those who waited inside them. A crucifix, a rosary, the ghost of a life held in silence. These small dark spaces are the most honest monuments the war ever produced. No one in this story emerges without shadow. Elizabeth signed the death warrants. The Vatican authorized the plots. The priests knew what they walked into. The hunters did what states always do. There are no heroes here, only believers, each convinced the eternal stakes justify the earthly cost. the secret war ended? The questions it asked have never been answered. For 45 years, a war fought in cipher rooms, priest holes, and torture chambers quietly shaped the world of intelligence, faith, and power that we still inhabit today. Subscribe for more hidden histories that changed everything.